turned it off, sorry. Good evening, welcome to Empower You. I'm Betty Overstreet, I'm the Community Relations Director. Have we got anybody here tonight that's never been here before? Oh, okay. Well, then I'm going to tell you a little bit about our history. Empower You started back in 2011, and it was the brainchild of Dan Reginald, who's also the founder and CEO of Frame USA. And his vision was to have classes at that time in and around the city on a diverse number of topics. So we try to cover many things, classes just for you to enjoy, classes that will get you engaged. Most of all, we like to educate you so that when you leave one of our classes, you can say, oh yeah, I really learned something tonight I didn't know. I can tell you personally, I've come to classes that I didn't think I was going to like at all. And some of them ended up being some of my favorite classes. So I encourage you, when you see classes on our list, if you think you're not interested, you might get surprised. So try some of them. Also, most of our classes are live streamed. And if they are live streamed, within a day or two, you'll find them on our website, so that if you want to go on and rewatch them, or if you want to tell one of your friends about this great class, they might want to see it. Yes? It's usually right underneath, well, first of all, once we've had the class on the website drops down to the bottom, and then you'll find, I think it's usually right under the date or the time of the class where it has, that's where you can go to see the live streaming. It's not in archive. It doesn't go in archive until we get to the semester, or the spring semester. It's in the current semester. For instance, tonight's class, once it's over, is going to drop to the bottom of all those classes. You got to scroll down and find it. So we try to get it up within a day or two. Sometimes it might be a little bit longer, but yeah, that's how you get to it. Also, we do like to have feedback from our audience. You can give your feedback to me or any person on the board, or you can go to info@empoweruohio.org and leave your comments. We also like for our attendees to give us some ideas on classes. So if there's something you'd like to see us do, please let us know what that is and we'll look into it. It's helpful if you know a speaker for whatever it is you're interested in. Otherwise, it's a little bit more challenging. Also, we are run strictly by donations. So towards the end of each class, we pass around our red buckets, and if you feel like you'd like to give a donation to keep us going, we appreciate that. Also, I want to go over a few of our classes coming up. Unless you registered for this Thursday night's class, you probably don't know this yet, but our class this Thursday was on tariffs. Dave Williams was going to present that class, and we've had to cancel that due to some time constraints for him. So we're going to try and do that again in the spring. So there won't be a class this Thursday. Next Tuesday, we have Matt Byrne coming in to talk about President Trump's impact on the federal judiciary. Matt Byrne represents clients in state and federal trial court and appellate litigation. So I think kind of what he's going to be talking about is how do the judges that get appointed, how do they affect us as the average American? So I think that's going to be a real interesting class. I hope you'll come to that. And then next Thursday is Understanding Financial Statements. This class is really for anybody, but it's mostly for the person that needs to obviously know that. If you're a small business owner, it would be helpful to you. If you're somebody that's, with a company that you just need to know a little bit. That happened to me when I was still in the workforce. I was an office manager, and I was asked to do certain things with the financial statements. Well, I didn't have that kind of background, so I didn't know, but I had to learn. But I only learned what I had to do what I had to do. I didn't learn the whole thing, so you might find it interesting. Then the following Tuesday on November 8th, we have Remembering Charles Krauthammer, and this is to pay pay honor to Charles Krauthammer. And our own Dan Reginald is going to be the speaker that night. If you've never been to a class that Dan's presented, you're really missing out. You need to come to this class because he's very good. He's very knowledgeable on anything he presents. He's a good speaker. He's a good teacher. So I encourage you to come to that one. And then the following Thursday, we have the history of the Roebling Suspension Bridge. And I can't tell you any more about that other than it is the history of the bridge, which I think is going to be real interesting. So those are the classes that we have coming up. Next, I'd like to just recognize our volunteers and board members that are here tonight. We have Jay Gronke back in the back. He's our producer, making sure this microphone works for me. We have Bill Roll, who's our treasurer. We have Joe Platt, who's on the board. We have Ken Bowman here tonight, who's on the board. And trust me when I tell you, we couldn't do what we do without these guys. So thank you, and please give them a hand. Also, at the end of our speaker's presentation, he will be taking questions. If you have a question, just please raise your hand and wait for me to get a microphone to you so that everybody here can hear your question as well as those online can hear it. And next, I'd like to ask Joe Platt to come up. And we have a door prize, so get your red tickets out. And the prize tonight is George Washington's Surprise Attack. I hope you got a lot of time because that looks kind of thick. Why don't you have this gentleman pull a ticket? Last three numbers, 438. There you go. What's your first name? What was your first name again? Barbara. Congratulations. You'll have to give us a book report on that. And Joe Platt's going to introduce our speaker.
Good evening. It's really a pleasure to introduce Bob Galbraith, the author tonight and our speaker. And it's a very exciting topic. Give you a little background on our speaker. Our speaker received his BS, a master's degree in geology at the University of Cincinnati in the 1960s. His career began with work in mineral exploration in Canada, most of Western United States, Papua New Guinea, New Zealand, and Australia. Since 1982, he's been involved in hazardous waste cleanup projects from California and Massachusetts, ranging in size from single underground tanks to the Nevada test site. After semi-retiring, he continued to do geologic consulting and kept busy selling real estate, tending beehives, and gardening. In December 2014, he retired, so to speak, and became the full-time resident of the Villages in Florida, where he's active in several clubs and plays water volleyball 4 or 5 times a week. He's a professor emeritus of Empower U and a former member of the Empower U board. And it's my pleasure to welcome Bob Galbraith.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. I'm glad you have this nice, cool weather. This is the first day I've had long pants on in 3.5 years. How many of you are Revolutionary War buffs? 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh, I'm in trouble. All right. Washington's attack on Trenton. Why in the world would Washington attack Trenton on New Year's Day? I'm sorry, Christmas Day. He was in a pickle. It was only a few days to the end of the year, and his army was going to disappear on January the 1st. Their enlistment was up. They were going to go home. They were tired. They hadn't won a single battle since capturing Boston. So for almost a year and a half, they'd been chased by the Hessians out of New York, across New Jersey, and into Pennsylvania. Pretty dire situation for the Continental Army. The next step, if nothing else happened, was the whole revolution was going to collapse. Congress, the Continental Congress in Philadelphia, was scared to death. The English intended to take Philadelphia next. That was our capital city. It was the largest city in the country. But they were in the colonies at that time. So everything looked pretty dire. And this talk is going to sort of raise the question about what is leadership, courage, sacrifice, and freedom. Why in the world did these men take on this battle? What motivated them? I first got really interested in the idea of leadership in high school. I went to a private high school and we had a rowing team, and I was on the team for all 4 years. The first 3 years, we had this Marine colonel who was the coach. He was a blustery guy, a Marine all the way, gung-ho, and the crews did fairly well. My senior year, he retired and we got a new coach. He was a mild-mannered English professor. He wore a tweed jacket every day and his tweed golf cap, and he never raised his voice louder than a mild tone. He demanded that we row 3 times farther in our practices than we ever did under the Marine colonel. And we did it. We were also undefeated. Pretty amazing, but what made this guy a leader? I couldn't figure it out. Sorry, I still get upset. It really moved me. But what is this question of leadership? How come some people become leaders and others don't? It's not something you want to have an answer to. It's something you want to live with the question about. Similarly, with courage, sacrifice, and what it means to have freedom. The plan, lunatic plan, went across the Delaware, starting at 6 p.m. All right, that's dark on December 25th. And by midnight, it planned to have 2,400 men across an 800-foot wide river that's full of ice chunks. Not only that, but it's sleeting, raining, or snowing all night long with a strong wind out of the northeast. And some people describe it as a true nor'easter. How many of you, since we're here in the north, have been out in a sleet storm? How long would you be willing to stay? Have you ever had a coat that was really good enough for an ice storm? These guys had very little in the way of clothing. Most of them didn't have winter clothing at all. But that was the plan. Then after they cross the river, they're going to march 10 miles, divide into 2 divisions, and attack Trenton. While they're doing that, General James Ewing was going to cross directly across to Trenton from the Pennsylvania with another 900 men, and Colonel John Cadwalader was going to attack with 2,000 men from the south. He was going to cross at another point south of Trenton and march north and block any retreat from Trenton in that direction. Ever heard of either of those 2 guys? It's because they didn't make it. Walder, I can't say his name, decided to give it up entirely and never even tried. Ewing got about 600 men across to the shore near Trenton, decided it was just too bad of conditions, and brought them all back again. Washington didn't know this, so over half of his expected force is not going to show up. And they were all supposed to be ready to attack at 6 o'clock in the morning, about an hour before sunrise. And this is the path. His main camp is up here. They're going to cross at Johnson's Ferry, come down this Bear Tavern Road, split the 2 divisions, 2nd Division going down Bennington Road, 1st Division coming on down to what becomes River Road, and attack 2 points at the same time, while Ewing's men who have crossed straight across attack the south side, and Cadwalader's come up from the south. Best laid plans always go awry as soon as you try and implement them. Key officers, Colonel John Glover from Massachusetts, absolutely vital to this operation. He's from Marblehead, He's from Marblehead, Massachusetts. He's got a multiracial group because these are all sailors that have come from all over the different parts of the world in here. 30 officers and 147 men. Colonel Henry Knox was in charge of the artillery. Anybody heard of Knox? Yeah, he eventually became our first Secretary of War. And he was in his mid-20s. He was a former bookseller in Boston. He had taken up artillery in a year and a half earlier in Boston, and his most notable thing to that date was that he had moved 60 cannon. I keep hitting the wrong button with this toy, that's not mine. He'd moved 160 cannon from Fort Ticonderoga to Boston the previous winter in order to support the siege of Boston. Then we had Nathaniel Greene, who was a former militia private. He was the son of Quakers, last person you'd expect in that time to be a general. But he had that, and he had been friends with Henry Knox since 1773. And finally, General John Sullivan, again with a large contingent from Massachusetts. Washington's artillery, this was really important. He had batteries. Oh, damn. Should have practiced with this thing. Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton, anybody know who he was? Yeah, first Secretary of the Treasury, shot Aaron Burr, various other things, but he was in charge of one of the batteries. Colonel Forrest, Sergeant Garman, they had a total of 18 cannon. And this was primary factor in Washington's thinking was to overpower the Hessians with superior firepower. And he had more cannon than anybody else. They were also distributed evenly. He had 4 pieces at the head of 1st Division and 3 at the head of the 2nd Division, because he wanted the cannon to get there first and be able to start firing at the enemy as soon as possible. Normal procedure in those days was to have the cannon come up last. The soldiers would all come first. He took a huge risk in doing this because that meant his cannon was vulnerable to ambush and the possibility of losing it all. If he lost the cannon, he was going to lose the battle. There's no question about that. Clear tactical vision was a total surprise. These guys are going to do this whole march in complete silence, in the dark, no torches. Can't see where you're going, at least not well. They had hoped to have a full moon, but what happened? Sleet, snow, rain, cloud cover the whole way. Hit hard and hit fast. That was the key to this thing, and use a pincer to cut off any hope of retreat. Sounds like a great plan. Use of artillery was just coming into its infancy. Frederick the Great was the first commander to really use artillery effectively. And he settled on 4 different kinds of cannon. And he standard on the 4 types. And he increased the ratio of cannon to soldiers to 6 to 1. Prior to that, it had been 2 to 3 to 1. Part of the reason he did that is he loved an infantry charge. And he'd lost so many men with his infantry charges, he had to increase his firepower. So he added more cannon to his infantry units. This was the startup. Washington then took this idea up and used the proper employment of artillery as being key to his thing. He increased the ratio to 7.5 to 1 for his artillery to the soldiers that he had with him. And he had literally 3 times more cannon than the Hessians did. And he was also planning on getting the high ground, setting his cannon there so anybody who had to try and charge on the cannon had to run uphill. These are what we're talking about. This is a cannon in the foreground. Get my finger on the right button. These are the boxes that carry the ammunition and the shot. They were part of the carriage at that time. Hadn't developed the trailing caisson that you'll see in all the Civil War action at this time. These were horse-drawn. In the background is a howitzer. It's a 5.5-inch howitzer. It's a stubby little thing. It's got a wooden tompion in the muzzle to keep it clean during transport. But if you take this little tompion out, there's just room for cannonball. There's a smaller cavity for the powder charge, and then just room for the cannonball. It really doesn't have a barrel. It's more of a poof, a pop gun sort of a thing. But with a howitzer, you have a higher elevation and you could fire over buildings and hit people behind other obstacles. So those were the two weapons that we had to go on. Preparation really started in early December, so this wasn't a spur of the moment plan on Washington's part. He had the New Jersey captains and one colonel gathering up every boat on the New Jersey side of the river before they actually crossed over from New Jersey to Pennsylvania. And then shortly after they got across from Pennsylvania, this is the Hessians chasing them across New Jersey. Shortly after they got across on December 10th, he had General Ewing and others gather all the boats on the eastern side, on the western side of the Delaware River for a distance of 70 miles. So he gathered every Durham boat and every flat ferry boat he could find. Part of this was to keep the Hessians from crossing behind him. The other part was in preparation for this attack that he was putting together back as early as December 10th, the attack that happened on the 25th. The Durham boats, anybody know what a Durham, anybody ever been in a Durham boat? I didn't think so. They're cargo. They're for heavy cargo. They're 20 to 40 feet long. They were built by a man named, I think it was James Durham, who owned a steel, or not a steel mill, an iron foundry. And he used them for hauling coal, limestone, and pig iron. They were also used for hauling bulk grain and other commodities, but that was what he invented them for. They have a chest-high sides, so they come up to about here on a person, and they're pointed at both ends, so they could pole them both upriver and downriver. And so they, in shallow water, they could raise them by poles. In deeper water, they had oars on their sides. There were 2,400 men to carry across an 800-foot wide river with ice chunks flowing. The river's in almost flood stage because of the rain they've been having. There were no piers on either side, so every man that got into one of these boats, and what they had to do was go out into the water, get at least their ankles wet, maybe their knees, climb over the side, fall into the boat, and then when they got the other side, they had to climb up and fall out of the boat. Yeah. We'll get there. No, couldn't do it. We'll get there next. So, but the point is, everybody, absolutely everybody, got their feet wet in freezing water. This is what the Durham boats look like. There's a bunch of reenactors. We don't have any of them in here, do we? Reenactors in here. That's what the boat looks like. This is a more close-up. And you can see they have a wide gunnel along here. This is where the polar would walk, pushing the boat in shallow water. And when it got too deep for that, then they'd sit down, and we've got 4 oarlocks on the sides of the boat. So 4 men would row this boat across the river. And to answer, well, and unfortunately the river looked something like this. It's not a picture of the day, but something like this. Ice chunks, you've got to step in mud and mush getting to the water. Once you're there, the boat's going to be out here someplace, so you're going to get all wet, getting in and getting out on the other side. Well, the key to this crossing was Colonel Glover and his mariners. They came from Marblehead, Massachusetts, which is a little northeast of Boston. They really disliked the British at this point. Not only because many of them had escaped from British ships, which were horrible places to live and work, but the British had blockaded their fishing grounds since the middle of 1775. Without anywhere to fish, they couldn't feed their families. Now they were at war with England, and the blockade was tightened up. They weren't home to do fishing. They weren't home to help with their families. Their wives and children were starving. They were here helping George Washington. And they turned out to be the undisputed masters of amphibious operations, because they're the ones that got Washington across the Hudson River out of New York. And they're also the same men that got him across the Delaware River from New Jersey into Pennsylvania. They had lots of experience doing this in their own. When they were fishermen, they were used to being out in inclement weather and rough conditions in the North Sea. So they were just ideal for this. Without them, the crossing never would have occurred. Well, if someone asked, there's cargo as well. There's 150 horses, 18 artillery pieces, various other stuff, a total of about 400 tons of equipment. None of that you're going to get in and out of a Durham boat. So one of the things they'd done is commandeered all the flat bottom ferry boats they could find on the Delaware River. And they had 5 or 6 of them to make this crossing. Again, it was Colonel Glover's people who manned the boats, got them across, but it was this Lieutenant Anthony Cuthbert, who's from Pennsylvania, from Philadelphia actually, and his company of longshoremen, riggers, and seamen who made sure the cannon were properly placed on the ferries. Couldn't have them too heavy on one side or the other. They had to be sure they wouldn't shift as the boats rocked in just the course of going across the water. They had to be sure that the horses were comforted and held steady so that they wouldn't rear up, throw the balance off, and have a ferry boat turn over. Could not afford to lose any of these cannon or the horses to pull them in this process. So these guys were the saviors for that. They're experienced riggers, knew what they were doing, and loaded the ferry boats properly. And this is typical of the ferry boat of that time, where you could drive a wagon onto one end and go across, and you could drive the wagon off the other end. The horses and wagons and artillery pieces were all unhitched from each other in case one horse panicked. You didn't want to pull in the rest of the team and whatever it was attached to into the water as well. Managed to get everybody across, no problem. The infantry was made up of a big variety: Delaware, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, Massachusetts, Connecticut. The Virginia and Maryland were pretty much slaveholders fighting for freedom. Delaware some of them may have been slaveholders. Massachusetts, Connecticut, Pennsylvania definitely were not. So we had this variety of outlooks on what was proper, but all of them were bound together by the idea of freedom. Disproportionate number of them were Irish and Scottish descent. This was also important because either they themselves or their families had been involved in revolts in Ireland and Scotland against the British. They had a long history of fighting the British. And to the surprise of the Hessians later on, this included a large contingent of Pennsylvania Dutch who spoke German fluently in this thing. So these were mainly the guys in there. Over 100 years, the colonies had been fighting the Indians and the French, been having some minor skirmishes here and there, and they had learned that they could organize into their own armies. This was an amazing place in the 100 years, 150 years before the Revolution as an experiment in sociology, if you will. They knew how to organize for war. Their skills that contributed to their growing sense of a self-assurance and reliance. And American first fighting differed from the European forest fighting, differed from European mass fighting. The Europeans liked to fight on a bright sunny day in a big field where you could see everybody and make big formations of soldiers. And the Indians tended to hide behind trees and ambush people, and our people had learned to fight that way. And most of them got together and mingled and talked to each other and got to know each other, so that they ended up with a unifying concept of all men are created equal. This is the most amazing document that had ever been written. It started out to say that all men are created equal. They may not have all believed that, but that was such an incredible goal to live for. And these guys were all in the colonies pretty much living equal. You came over, and if you had any gumption at all, you could get some land. You could own land. You either buy it or you could go into the wilderness and clear it and claim it yourself. You couldn't do that anywhere in Europe. All the land was owned by the king or the princes or the lords in the area. You couldn't go out and hunt for deer in England because they all belonged to the king. You were a poacher if you went out and hunted for deer. In America, you could go out and hunt for deer even if you lived in a city. You just go out of town, hunt for deer, and you feed your family for a while. Very different idea. It wasn't that somebody said we're going to be free. When they came over here, there were no constraints. It was sort of different in that respect. So, who was George Washington? He had this crazy idea. You need to have a little background on him. And he was born on February 22nd, 1732. His father died about 11 years later. And at that time, George inherited Ferry Farm on the Rappahannock River. Everybody thinks of George Washington and Mount Vernon. Well, George was the third son. He had two half-brothers, and the oldest of the half-brothers got Mount Vernon. His older brother Augustine got Mount Vernon. And George was also probably the least educated of any president we ever had. His mother didn't believe in education. But he did like to read, and so he read things like Don Quixote and the Tristram Shandy stories. There are 8 volumes of very verbose stories about all kinds of things. Fascinated him. But the one book that really made a huge difference in his life is The Rules of Conduct and Politeness, written in 1595 by some Jesuit priests. He loved this book. He read it over and over and memorized it virtually. And it turns out that courtesy and decorum became his option into promotion, his opening into promotion. Because everywhere else in English and European society, you couldn't get into the upper class unless you were born into it. And then you had to be the first son. If you weren't the first son, you weren't going to get any inheritance. These are the guys then that bought commissions in the military. They didn't have to earn their commissions, they just had to have enough money to buy them. Well, George didn't have that. But the book taught him all these things. I'm not going to read the list to you, but hopefully you can in this process. But things like generosity, prudence, fidelity, piety, but most of all, the little spark of celestial fire called a conscience. Let your conscience be your guide, long before Jiminy Cricket. In Washington's career at age 14, he became a land surveyor. He was a natural at it, apparently. He did a lot of work in the frontier areas. And before very long, he had accumulated about 1,400 acres, mostly wild country. But at the age of 21, he had that much land. So he was starting to be a landed person. Physically, he was a big guy, over 6 feet tall, broad shoulders, narrow waist. He did have terrible smallpox scars on his face, but he was a pretty good ladies' man from all accounts. And in those times in that place, morals were pretty loose. He enjoyed a lot of female companionship. Lawrence Washington, George's father, had been on an expedition to the Cartagena, and the admiral that was in charge of the thing was named Vernon, Admiral Vernon, so he named his plantation when he got back Mount Vernon. He was a member of the House of Burgess. He married Anne Fairfax, the daughter of a Colonel Fairfax, and a member of the Governor's Council, and cousin to Lord Fairfax. So who possessed nearly 6 million acres. That's a lot of land. Virginia was very much a land of, or a colony of the landed aristocracy. It's just, that was the way it was, compared to New England, which was a lot of little towns based on a church and then farming land around that. It was very different societies, but they all managed to blend together to form this, operation. But young George found himself welcome, not only at Mount Vernon, his brother's fancy estate, but at Belvedere and the Greenway Court, because he could behave like a gentleman. He'd learned what courtesy and proper decorum was. And therefore, these snotty people thought he was worth something. He was more like them than he was like the uneducated boob that he probably really was. Very interesting that this was his opening to promotion. Long story in here of the battles and whatnot. In 1751, he went to Williamsburg to present his other brother's papers because his brother was ill, to Robert Dinwiddie. There's a county named after him now. The new governor of the colony, he asked, shortly thereafter, the colony was divided into two sections. George asked to be the military representative of one of those two sections, and he was given the southern half of it and given the major's rank. And he was sent to carry a message to the French at Fort Duchesne, which is now Pittsburgh. On his way, the French and the Indians ambushed his party and nearly killed everybody. He managed to escape and walked back over the Appalachians. From that thing, he returned the next January in the cold after that excavation. In 1754, he was Lieutenant Colonel Washington, given the same task as part of a larger British force. And this time, the British section of it got ambushed, but he managed to ambush a French section beforehand and comported himself very well in winning that battle. But overall, the British lost. They retreated, built Fort Necessity. The French came and destroyed Fort Necessity, and again, they had to walk back over the Appalachians in defeat. Not a sterling military record, but George had always wanted to be in the military. It was his lifelong ambition. But one of the biggest aggravations for him was, even though he was the rank of major or lieutenant colonel, the junior officers, English officers under him, paid no attention to him. He hadn't been part of the aristocracy, hadn't bought his rank. He was just a bumpkin who'd been given a rank. They didn't like it, didn't respect him, and he hated them for it. Doesn't make you a very effective commander when the people you're trying to command won't pay attention to you. And then finally, 1755, Colonel George Washington won the Battle of the Wilderness, and he was then spent 3 years learning wilderness warfare, and at the same time suffered both malaria and dysentery. His health was not all that great, but he was successful on the frontier from then on, and he learned how to fight the Indians. In 1758, Fort Duchesne was finally captured, and he finally got Mount Vernon when his brother passed away in 1761. Shortly after that, he married into money, and after his marriage, he was probably the wealthiest man in Virginia. He was elected to the House of Burgesses, and then his real military career started in 1775 when the Continental Congress sent him to Boston as general for the Continental Army. His reputation was unrivaled physical and moral courage, steadfastness in adversity, so forth. You can read what is up here. The most important thing, I think, in here was his recognition by his men that he was stern but fair discipline. They made him beloved of his men. On more than one occasion, he had men hanged for insubordination, or for dereliction of duty, or for going AWOL. So it wasn't that he was a softy. He did have stern discipline, but they liked him very much. And the officers liked him too because of his simple dignity. Again, the outgrowth of having read that little book, pamphlet by the Jesuits. So unlike the British military system, the Revolutionary Army of free men and mostly yeomen, farmers, was an unprecedented place. They could rise due to their own activity. You could be, you know, what you did counted rather than who you knew or who had the money. But could these people actually win this attack? That was the question that bothered almost all of his officers and men. Here they were setting off after dark in a snowstorm with a 10-mile walk if they got across the river, and most of them couldn't swim. This was the big question. So here's where they're going to go. We're going to start Washington's camp here, cross over, move down this way, split here, go to Trenton. First thing after they crossed the river is they had to climb up out of the valley. It's about 150 feet change in elevation. They had to drag the cannons up the slippery slope. It's covered in ice. It's still snowing and raining. They got up there and they got to the Johnson Ferry House, where Washington gathered together all his officers to go over one final plan, and he let the men have a 1-hour rest. It had taken over 3 hours to get everybody across and all the equipment across. And so it was, you know, something that really needed to happen. They tore down miles of fence, split rail fences, and built fires, bonfires, and warmed up and got a rest. Yeah.
How many times did the boats have to go back and forth?
No, nobody kept good records of that. I don't really know. But it's probably, each boat probably made 4 or 5 trips. And they probably had 30 to 40 boats. It took a long time to do it. And these are the same guys going back and forth and back and forth. They've been up as long as everybody else. It's an amazing trip. So the next step, they headed south on the Bear Tavern Road, and they ran into Jacob's Creek. And this is a modern topographic map, but here's the road coming down here. Each one of these brown lines represents a change in elevation of 20 feet. So they had to go down a slope of over 100 feet to get to the creek. The creek, of course, was in flood because it's raining and snowing, had been for several days. So they had to unhitch the horses, manually get the cannon down this slope, and it probably wasn't as gentle as it is on today's maps. Get them across the flooded creek, which fortunately was the bottom of the creek is on horizontal rock, so it was a flat, smooth surface to get across. They didn't have a lot of ruts there. And then they got another 100 yards, and lo and behold, here's Ewing Creek. Not quite as big, but it's the same problem. They got to get across that creek. Again, everybody's feet and ankles are getting wet. They're slipping and sliding in the mud on the slopes and coming back up this side of the Creek Valley. Can't imagine. Next stop is at Birmingham Crossing. And here again, Washington stopped. It's about 4 o'clock in the morning at this point. Stopped for an hour to let the men rest. But this is where they divided into 2 divisions. Greene's 2nd division was going to go northeast, and then come down Pennington Road, and the 1st division was going to come straight down here. So Greene's men started out first because it was going to take them longer. There were 2 advanced parties in their force that were screening for the possibility of any Tories that might be out there. Again, they were keeping total silence through this whole march, no talking. They'd wrapped rags around all their loose equipment, make sure it didn't jingle at the night so that nobody would hear them coming. And Captain Washington had a Virginia group. This is a different Washington. He's not related to George. Down the Pennington Road, but he did have a guy in his squad named James Monroe. Anybody know who he turned out to be? 5th President of the United States. So he was in this advance. And the other was Captain John Ballhaven's, New Jersey. He was an Irish-born Catholic. He and his men went down River Road, leading the way. And they got almost all the way to Trenton. And amazingly, they did it in the same amount of time. But the question still remained, could they fight? They'd been in this rain. They got to Trenton. This was about 8 o'clock in the morning. Started at 6 o'clock in the evening. That's 14 hours. 2 hours of rest in that period of time, but they're getting rained on all the time. And what are they using for weapons? Black powder. And you've got to keep your powder dry. Question is, had they done a successful job of that? It turns out that since many of them had been hunters in the winter or gone to war in the winter time, they seemed to have a lot of wars in the winter time in colonial periods. They knew how to keep their weapons dry, and one of their clever inventions was called a cow's knee. And it looked like this. It was a deer skin, greased, oiled deer skin that they tied over the flintlock and the flash pan on their rifles so that they wouldn't get wet. And it was really important that they keep their powder dry because they had very few bayonets. And so if they couldn't shoot their rifles, they were going to have to use them as clubs. That was it. And with the cannon fire, same problem. Well, they had been smart enough to put torch holes plugged with tampions, not tampons, and the bore plug with, tampions. These are just wooden plugs, but they had to be wedged in, and they had to be watched because they would tend to bounce loose as they went over rocks and ice and so forth. So gunners were all very careful to watch out for these things. But the frontier soldiers had also hunted for food in the wintertime, and this helped them out. They knew about cover and dispersion and so forth, so they were ready and everything as long as that powder stayed dry. The main strike force was Green's 2nd Division, 4 brigades involved in it. They're mostly from Virginia, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, Massachusetts, and Connecticut. Sullivan's 1st Division had 3 brigades, sergeants commanded by General Sergeant Glover and St. Clair. These guys are mostly New York, Connecticut, and Massachusetts. But they all fought together. And then the artillery, as I said earlier, was evenly divided between the 2 brigades, or the 2 divisions. Who were the Hessians, after all? These are the people that they're going to attack. These are the guys that had chased them out of New York City. These guys had attacked them in several fortified locations in New Jersey and beaten them. Whoops. This thing drives me nuts. The British government had bought 30,000 German mercenaries to fight fight for England. The English had gone through a whole series of wars up to this point, and the way they did their recruiting in England was to go into the bars and just watch for people walking down the street alone, grab them and say, "You've enlisted." Shanghaiing was a term used later for the Navy, but the Army did the same thing. Well, Britain was running out of people that were in bars and so forth to Shanghai. And so the 50,000 people, soldiers they wanted to send to the colonies to put down the revolution, they bought 30,000 from German princes. And more than half of them came from the little province of Hesse-Kassel, and so they were called Hessians. They carried a well-balanced, beautifully crafted short rifle, and it was very accurate. But what they were really known for was a bayonet charge. That's what their real force was, and that's why they were feared so much. Because if you've got a whole bunch of guys coming at you with these sharp, pointy things, it can be terrifying. And they had repeatedly beaten Washington, so they were very confident about that. Britain paid $35 for every one that was killed and $12 for every one that was wounded. They were worth more dead than alive. I didn't get a laugh that time. But they also paid $500 annually to the principality. Well, recruiting methods were the same in Hesse-Kassel as they were in England. The princes went out and got everybody who wasn't a first son, who was going to inherit his land or going to take over the farm for wherever they were. And all those young men were commandeered into the prince's service. The prince then sold them to England. They were no better than slaves at this point. They were hyped up, lots of propaganda, make them feel great, but they really had no choice in the matter of where they were or what they were doing. Colonel Johann Gottlieb Rahl was in charge of the Trenton detachment, and he came from humble beginnings. He actually had worked his way up through the military hierarchy, and he'd had 30 years of experience. He'd been a very successful leader in every battle he was in, and again, he was the one who managed to defeat Washington every time they met him. His troops were tightly bonded. The garrison was full of watchful alert that night. In fact, many of the Hessians slept in their uniforms with their cartridge boxes already on. How many of you heard that the Hessians were partying all day on Christmas Day and drunk? That's a rumor. No, it's totally unfounded. In fact, they were very religious, probably were very devout in their celebration of Christmas. And every time they marched into battle, the people that they were going to fight against recorded hearing them singing hymns while they were marching to battle. So these guys were ready just because of a normal thing. And also, they had been harassed by a group of rebels from Virginia, totally unbeknownst to Washington, who had been sneaking in close to Trenton and sniping at them night after night for 3 or 4 nights before this one. And so they were all on edge and worried about a night attack because of that activity. So anyway, the difference for them was they were sleeping in houses, out of the weather, nice, well, I should say nice and warm, maybe not, but warmer than the guys walking in the snow and rain with no shoes on. And this is the kind of uniforms that they wore. They also had these very tall hats that they wore to make them look even bigger and more menacing. They polished them up real well. They polished their bayonets up real well so that they sparkle and reflect in the broad daylight when they had a nice battle on a sunny afternoon. And their main weapon was the bayonet. And you can't really tell from this direction, but the thing that made the bayonet so fearsome is it has a triangular cross-section. If you get a wound like that, it's very hard to get the middle of the wound to knit back together. And so any wound if you survived the bayonet stabbing, you had a problem with worrying about infection and not having the wound close after all. So that was the Hessians. They also had a very low opinion of the Continental soldiers. They considered them to be half-starved, half-clothed, half-armed, discontented, ungovernable, and undisputed wretches, undisciplined wretches. Probably the first two were true. They were half-starved and half-clothed. They weren't maybe a little better than half-armed, and they certainly were discontented with England. Maybe not with their own management, but they certainly were discontented with England, and they were certainly governable by England. Whether they were undisciplined wretches or not depended on the particular unit. And Washington possessed neither leadership nor offensive capabilities as far as the Hessian or the British were concerned. Were they prepared? Well, Johnson's Ferry, where the Americans had crossed was not defended at all. They had no riders out patrolling the area, but they did have 7 fixed picket locations along the roads for their defense. And they were on Pennington Road, River Road, Princeton Road. Greene's division again showed up. I'm not going to go through that again. But they had advanced along with Pennington Road, and then Sullivan's division came along, advancing along River Road. And their artillery assignments were, as we've talked about before, where we're led by 2 6-pounders and 2 5.5-inch howitzers. Those are the 2 guns I showed in pictures earlier. Then came Hamilton with 2 6-pounders, 3 3-pounders. The 1st Division on the River Road had slightly fewer guns, total of 7. Most of them were in the 1st Division because they were headed for the high ground. So the first skirmish occurred just about a mile outside of Trenton, where they ran into the Hessian guards that were out in front. Lieutenant Anders Wiederhold was the first Hessian to see the Americans coming. And they were spread out in a line coming through the woods. And first he thought, maybe, is this another little skirmish that we're going to have, a little sniper activity? And then he realized that they were marching too well organized. They were almost as organized as Hessians. And so he started firing at them to get them to stop. In the south, we have Captain Ernest Eberhard Altenbochem. And he had basically 20 skirmishers with him, and they were mostly exhausted because they'd been up all night, and they had been chasing around looking for these skirmishers. But they heard firing to the north, and about the same time they started seeing the Americans coming through the snow, and they started defending that. Both groups led a valiant retreat back to Trenton. And this was the situation then when the battle started at 8 o'clock in the morning. Again, this is 14 hours after they'd started out. I can't imagine marching for that long in the snow and the rain and the cold, worried about my powder staying dry, keeping my spirits up. The situation in Trenton, and this is a half mile here, so it's about a half mile the length of Trenton. Ball's regiment was located here in the center part of town. Losberg's was over on the right, and down here was Kniphausen regiment. They weren't actually there at those spots. The men were all spread out over town, sleeping in houses that had been abandoned or various other buildings to stay out of the storm. And then most of them, even though the sun had been up for about an hour, were still sleeping because nobody expected anything to happen on a snowy day like this. So the skirmishers first attacked in here and moved in here. Captain Thomas Forrest was the first artillery group that came in there. His group was picked because he had the best officers and commanders in his artillery squadron. They rushed in and set up their cannon on the high ground at the north side of Trenton, and they had with them 132 round shot, 467 grape shot, and 161 canisters. Now, a round shot, you all know what that is. That's a cannonball. And the cannons fired at a fairly low trajectory, so that sometimes it didn't fly very far, but if they hit the ground, they'd ricochet up again. And so 2 or 3 times hitting the ground and ricocheting up would happen before they ran out of all their energy. And if you were still in front of the cannonball after 3 ricochets, you still lost a leg or a foot or a big chunk of something out of you. The canister was the next size thing. Those canister balls were about 1.5 inches in diameter, and there may be 2 dozen of them in the package, and that made the cannon more of a shotgun type of a shot. The canister would tear through horses with no trouble. But what they really were happy to have a lot of was grape shot. Grape shot's about 3/4 inch in diameter, and there may be 5 or 6 dozen grape shots in a charge, and it made the cannon into a shotgun. They spread out very quickly and very good against anti-personnel. So in short order, Washington set up his command post here on the north side of Trenton, set up cannon to fire down King Street, and the other cannon to fire down Queen Street, and trapped Rawle in between. He was sleeping in a building in between these two streets. His command post was over here, and two of his 4 cannon were here. His other 2 cannon were down here. As the battle started mainly with cannon fire, Mercer's men spread out here on the west side of Trenton, and with their Pennsylvania rifles started picking off Hessians sniper style. So the Hessians were caught in a crossfire, cannons firing from north to south, and then fire coming in from west to east. While all the attention was gathered up that way, and Alexander Hamilton brought in his second artillery unit. And of course, the interesting thing about Hamilton was he was born in the Caribbean in a dysfunctional slave-owning family. In fact, he might have been part black, and he was an outspoken opponent of slavery, and eventually he became our Secretary of Treasury. A lot of people were prejudiced against him in various ways, but he valiantly ran his artillery here. So the next thing to happen, here we are, is that the 1st Division came down. St. Clair brought in, tightened up the grip on the west side of Trenton. Sergeant came down and finally blocked the road here. About 600 Hessians and a number of townspeople that were Tories had managed to escape before they closed that off. Then Glover and his men moved around to the farthest distance. I mean, these are guys who have been rowing boats all night and then marched 10 miles, moved the farthest around to that side to trap everybody in here. The Hessians first tried to get out, get to their cannon. They did manage to get them a little ways up the road to fire back a few times. There is some time between a cannon shot and the next cannon shot. These are not rapid fire weapons at all, but they could not sustain the losses they couldn't keep getting the losses they were getting because of all the cannon that Washington had mounted at the head of the town. Lewisburg tried to move out to the northeast, but he was trapped by the soldiers up here. And then Kniphausen tried to swing around this way to try and outflank the Americans. None of that was successful. The Rawle and his men retreated back into town and tried to come out to the east. Lipsbury brought his troops back around. They joined together and tried to reattack through an apple orchard. But since there were no leaves on the trees, they didn't afford them any cover, and the Americans moved their cannon over and fired down into this area. Kniphausen came around again trying to do an outside turn, and things just got in tighter. What happened here? There, finally, Glover and his men crossed the creek here and surrounded all of them, and they surrendered. The battle lasted about 45 minutes. All that time for a 45-minute battle. Casualty report. Colonel Rail was wounded, and he was shot twice by the snipers on the west side, and had 22 of his men killed, 83 seriously wounded, and about 900 captured, along with 4 brass cannon. About 600 of them got away. The American losses were 2 men wounded for sure, and perhaps 2 others killed. There's some dispute about whether that happened or not. The Hessians thought this was largely because they didn't know how to keep their powder dry. They couldn't return rifle fire, and they never got a chance to do a bayonet charge. The cannon fire would not allow that. They tried to get out on the street, form up, and the grape shot would go through them. England and Germany were shocked, and Lord Cornwallis, who of course was in charge of all the forces in the colonies, was thunderstruck. They had gone in a matter of 24 hours from thinking they would win the war easily. Congress was about to give up, to discovering that they were up against a guy who would do audacious things and could actually win the war. Within a few days, they moved on and captured Princeton, and then he retired to Valley Forge for the winter. At that point, both sides wanted to take the winter off. Washington's assessment of his men, these are all quotes from Washington. He says, act from the noblest of principles, love of freedom and their country. It is subordination and discipline which next, under providence, is to make us formidable to our enemies, honorable in ourselves, and respected in the world. Washington could now admit that providence has been more bountiful to me than I deserve. So that's how he became father of our country. Final thought, again, back to this question of freedom. The Greeks invented the word freedom in 480 BC. And they had a big battle. It was a sea battle. A small Greek force of sailors who had elected to be sailors and go into battle because they were free to do so from their city, defeated a far larger Persian battle. In fact, they slaughtered about 40,000 Persians, and there were like 20,000 Greeks to start with. But they had invented the word freedom just before that, and proved to be the real key to their victory. Freedom, they believed, had made them warriors, quality, better fighters than the Persians or in any other unfree tribe, people, or state. And over the long haul, history shows us that over a long haul, men fight better when they know that they have had the freedom to choose the occasion of their own deaths. That's what these guys did at Trenton. They had the occasion to choose their own deaths, to go ahead, do this, to do whatever it took, listen to the commands as they went through the whole evening, and finally win the battle. This is the book that most of this talk came from, and somebody won it. I have mixed feelings about the book. It has incredible information I think everybody should read. It's probably the most poorly presented information I've ever seen in my life. The guy needed an editor, and he probably refused several in here. But this is where most of the story came from. The second book is The 13 Colonies. This is really a valuable book because I hadn't, I had history, I'm 75, I had history in the 50s when they still taught history, and learned some basic things about the colonies, but really didn't learn a whole lot about what life was like in each of the different colonies, and they were quite different because of geography and the people that happened to settle in them. But this one really gives you a good idea of how come the idea of freedom all of a sudden sparked this whole movement. How come all the colonies all of a sudden, at least 50% of the occupants of the colonies were in favor of the war when the Declaration of Independence was written. This book is very helpful doing that. 1776 is also a great book because it tells you what's going on in Europe up to this point. How come the English really wanted to fight this war? Actually, they didn't, but they had to because of economic conditions. And then this George Washington's War gives you a greater detail about Washington than I've ever seen anywhere else. And finally, this Courage and Culture, Carnage and Culture, I'm sorry, is the book that talks about this freedom and how it's impacted warfare throughout the history from 480 to the BC to the present. Questions? I'll put you all to sleep.
Wait for the microphone, please.
The two commanders that gave up and didn't follow out on the orders, what happened to them?
Ewing actually, when he heard the fight start across the river in Trenton, fired his cannons into Trenton as well. But he soon realized he had no idea who he was shooting at, so he had to stop. Beyond that, I have no idea what happened to them. They're lost in history as far as I'm concerned. Anybody else? Yes, ma'am.
Just a second.
On the radio this morning, they had a book interview on Dr. Samuel Rush
Yeah.
and said that he got involved with the revolution at this Battle of Trenton and became quite a notable figure after that.
Yeah, maybe after that, but I only looked at leading up to it. I haven't really followed up
Oh,
afterwards. Yeah, I heard
okay.
part of that interview as well. I thought it was fascinating. I have to look
Yeah,
into
it
him
sounded
next.
like a good book.
Yeah, I have to look into him next.
So how did Washington realize that those other 2 units weren't coming? And I mean, how
After
did
the
he-
battle was over and he looked around and they weren't there.
Well, how did they know for his men to go and take their place?
Because
It looked like
nobody was there. They took the initiative.
Okay.
They saw that there were supposed to be people there, but they didn't show up. So they had to go that extra mile. Fortunately, the initial fire by Washington from the high ground was distracting most of the Hessians sufficiently so that they didn't face a lot of resistance while they were swinging around the bottom. The book, probably a third of the book, describes this 45 minutes of battle. It's really incredible in there. And it also is just filled with personal letters from all kinds of people that were involved in the thing. One of the interesting things afterwards, when the Hessians gave up, they were surprised to find all the soldiers from Pennsylvania that spoke perfect Dutch or German. They could talk with them. The American soldiers were surprised to find that the Hessians were just farmers and merchants like they were. The various similarities. A lot of the Hessians began to wonder, why in the world are we fighting for England when it looks like what we're fighting against is a whole heck of a lot better than the life we're living. A lot of them, after the war, stayed in the United States, and many of them during the war went AWOL and stayed in the United States, because there was this call of freedom again that came up. There was another question.
Did Washington have any prior intelligence on the Hessian armament and size of the?
Yeah, he knew the size of the forces that were there. And he did have some information about where they were in the town, but not a whole lot. I mean, these were the guys that had been chasing him for a long time. They were on the other side of the river. They couldn't get good firsthand immediate information about them. Yes.
Dan Bowman, what was the next battle after Trenton?
Princeton.
Princeton? Okay, thank you.
Yeah. It was within a couple of days. They did capture Princeton as well.
We have a question online.
We have a question from a virtual viewer. How did George get so lucky as to marry such a rich lady at that time of his life?
As I say, he had a reputation as quite a ladies' man. He was big and handsome, and he was an officer. So I'm not surprised that he managed to catch the eye of a young lady with lots of money. Yes, sir.
What happened to the Hessians that escaped?
They went back around to Princeton and were involved in the battle for Princeton, and many of them got captured the second time. Okay.
Do we have any more questions?
Thanks for listening to a geologist.
No. Thank you, Bob. Can you say when you leave here tonight that you learned something, you got educated? Well, that's good. And we fulfilled our mission for tonight. So thank you for coming, and we look forward to you back for another class, and have a safe trip home.